correct understanding of this. D, a bit spurious, weak, not authentic, not authoritative, and so they won't use it. But what they do is that they develop an eclectic edition of the New Testament using existing manuscripts. Metzger, for example, and he's a conservative scholar, in his book, The Text for the New Testament and its Development, he says, lest, however, the wrong impression be conveyed from the statistics given above regarding the total number of Greek manuscripts, it should be pointed out that most of the papyri are relatively fragmentary and that only about 50 contain the entire New Testament. Now, what does that tell you from a conservative scholar such as Metzger? If you look at the 5,847 Greek manuscripts, no two, apart from the tiniest fragments, are identical. Until the 8th century, there is not one Greek manuscript that contains the books of the New Testament in the present order that we have them. You've got the Uspensky Gospels, the first dated New Testament in about 835. Of the 5,847 manuscripts, 11 of these manuscripts are in the minuscule type of handwriting. That writing dates from the 9th century onwards. 2,279 are in lectionaries, also a type of writing. That's only about 30 lectionaries date from before the 9th century, meaning the majority date after the 9th century, 900 years after Jesus. And that's something similar to what I'd suggest. Bart Ehrman, for example, the same scholar that I quoted, he states that when one compares one manuscript to another, no two copies agree in their wording. And this is his quotation. He says there's been something that 200,000 and 300,000 variations amongst all the manuscripts, which is more variations than the New Testament itself. That was the first New Testament ever compiled by a chap called Desiderius Erasmus, issued at Basel in 1516. The first time that you had the complete Greek New Testament. And what he did was that he used the corrupted existing manuscripts after the 9th century, or whatever existed, to compile the New Testament. Several readings have been found which have never been found in the existing manuscripts. What does it tell you? It tells you the chap was editing. Theodore Beza, for example, used the corrupt Byzantine text type manuscripts and published 9 editions of the Greek New Testament before 1565 and 1604. And that, in fact, formed the basis of the King James Version. So they're using manuscripts dating later, and based on all these fragments, they're compiling what we have, an eclectic edition of the New Testament. These are some of the basic Greek texts in the Christian world, the major uncials: Vaticanus, Alexandrinus, and Sinaiticus. Sinaiticus, which is the oldest, I'd urge you to check www.codexsinaiticus.co.za. For the first time, that's going to be released to the public. And in the Sinaiticus, I don't have time to amplify too further, which is the oldest, dating to the 4th century, 400 years after Jesus. What you'd find there is books contained which don't appear in the existing New Testament. For example, we've got here the Shepherd of Hermas, the Epistle of Barnabas, different portions considered part of biblical canon by the editors of the Codex, but they were not considered later on. And that was a chap who discovered them, Constantine von Tischendorf, in St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai, which caused major apprehension in the world. When compared with the New Testament, there was something like 14,800 editorial alterations to the existing New Testament in the early 19th century, late 19th century or mid 19th century. And look at the narratives that are not contained there. They carry a different story about Jesus. The word describing Jesus Christ as the Son of God do not appear in the opening narratives of Mark. Therefore, in the New International Version, the New International Version and the RSV don't contain that. They don't contain Jesus in the opening passage described as the Son of God, even though the King James Version has it, because the older manuscripts that have been discovered don't contain these. The ascension of Jesus doesn't occur in Mark chapter 16 verse 9 to 20 and Luke 24 verse 51. There is no reference to the Trinity. The first epistle of John chapter 5 verse 7. There is no reference to the women caught in the act of adultery. If you look at the differences even between the manuscripts, Hoskia, for example, enumerates something like 3,036 differences between Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Look at the difference in all these two major uncials. These are further verses which can't be found in Sinaiticus. So what are they doing in the existing King James Version? What are they doing in the existing Bibles? A total of 1547 words are not in the Gospel of Luke. The oldest Bible, the oldest existing uncial doesn't have that. So what do the new editions, those that were compiled later? The omitted phrases in Sinaiticus. Luke has 10,000 words. Let's assume that we did have the original, for argument's sake. One ways to approach the New Testament could be also to use what we would call the literary historical method, and that analyzes the genre of the book, the nuances, the style. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, if I could just probably go to that particular slide. If you look at the dates of the Gospels in theory, Matthew was written in about 100 AD. John about 110, Luke in the year 75, and Mark in the year 60 to 65. David has conceded the idea of Markan priority, where he states that Mark was in fact the first gospel. But these writings were in theory. At the point when these particular gospels were written, all the authors, for example, were dead at their compilation. So who could have written them? For example, if you look at John of Zebedee, John was written near Ephesus between 110 and 115. John of Zebedee was beheaded by Agrippa I in the year 44 of the Common Era. Did the Holy Spirit inspire the Apostle John to write this gospel 60 years after he was killed? No one knows the answer. So you can see that when you even accept the dates, it becomes a significant problem. Crowley's encyclopedia, many have traced John's conceptions to Greek origins, like the Alexandrian Gnosticism surrounding the concept of the Logos, and so on and so forth. We want to move to something called the relationship between the Synoptic Gospels. You see, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels because they have so many stories that can be placed side by side in columns and seen together. Look at this as an analogy. You've got 3 newspapers, and you compare the newspaper's treatment to a particular story. They have a source. You've got the Cape Argus and you've got the Cape Times. Sometimes you'd have an identical story in the Cape Argus and the Cape Times, word for word. And you've got it at the back that they'd basically, at the end of the story, it'll have their Reuters, Associated Press, Agency France Press. It means that the newspaper takes it from an identical source. Sometimes you've got journalists from 2 different papers giving a brief summary of an event, and they'd give you a summary of the event, but they'll give you their own opinions and their own writings. When they have an identical account, it means they have been reproduced from the same source. When they have a different account, it means that the writers were writing in different times and different periods. Now, in principle, you have a similar situation in the Gospels. For example, you find passages by Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the same. And we have to concede that they all drew from the same particular source. What was that source? Sometimes you have the same stories in 2, sometimes in all 3, sometimes differences in all 3. Scholars have called it the 4-source hypothesis. Accordingly, Mark, and David accepts this, is the first gospel to be written, and it was used by Matthew and Luke. Both of these Gospels had what scholars call Q, or Quella, from the German word Quella. Q, in fact, provided Matthew and Luke with material that they found they had in common, which are not found in Mark. So you had something like this. Close to 41% from Matthew comes from Mark, close to 45% from Luke comes from Mark, and then of course you've got material which is only unique to Matthew, you've got material unique to Luke, you've got a double tradition between Matthew and Luke which is very slight, and then of course you've got sources drawn from other materials which scholars have upheld are called Quella, the German source Q. So in other words, all these writers were writing in different times and they were drawing from different particular sources. But in principle, they were basically drawing from Mark. Now, how do we look at that? I mean, you know, if you, for example, look at some of the key differences between, say, John, because we talk about Matthew, Mark, Luke, but we don't discuss John. John is seen in a different category. Sometimes you find in John's Gospels, unique to John are for example, the I am sayings. I see David has quoted considerably from the Gospel of John. Where Jesus says, I am the resurrection of life. There is no reference to the virgin birth in John. It's not explicitly baptized. John's Gospel does not explicitly teach the coming of the kingdom of God, which is quite interesting. Because instead it speaks about a heavenly life by eternal birth. The apocalyptic worldview, which is found in Mark, is non-existent in John. So you see, it's a different style, a different writing, written to a different particular people. What about the changes that existed? I mean, each time an older manuscript of the Bible is discovered, many changes are required in order to bring the Bible up into particular standard. I mean, look at Mark 1:1, the beginning of the gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The NIV doesn't have that anymore. Another particular change can be in Acts of the Apostles, 8:37. In every honest translation of the Bible, the title Son of God is not there. Truly this man was a son of God. Mark chapter 15 verse 39. That particular concept is doubtful. But the same confession at that particular moment by a centurion in another gospel, the Gospel of Luke, doesn't contain the word truly this man was a son of God. There the centurion says certainly this man was innocent. So why is it that in one gospel you have something particularly said by a particular person about Jesus, in another gospel it's not there, or it's sometimes minimized, or sometimes it's not contained at all? Calling God, for example, Father in Matthew's gospel. I mean, in all three gospels, we look at Mark, Luke, and Matthew, regarding Jesus asking his disciples who they are, and David spoke about Peter's reply. In Peter's reply in Mark, Peter says to Jesus, you are the Christ. In Luke, he says, you are the Christ of God. In Matthew, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. So what can you see? Did Peter say all of these things at the particular point in time? Or did the writer, in a sense, whoever was writing, evolve the actual statement made by the particular writer? Notice that Matthew has added the phrase, Son of the living God, to Peter's declaration. Luke just had, you are the Christ of God. So you can see it's an evolution. It's as if Mark was the original gospel, the first gospel, and then as the other writers wrote, Matthew and Luke, and then subsequently John, they decided to add, of course, to establish certain theological points. And of course we can go on. But one thing which has troubled scholars for quite some time, and that can be as a practically open illustration. If you look at an opening illustration of the death of Jesus, which is found in Mark and John. Mark, as I said, was one of the first Gospels to be written. And one of the main kind of pointers we read is that at the end of his life in Mark, Jesus makes a journey to Jerusalem in order to celebrate what we would call the Jewish feast of the Passover, whilst he's there and he's arrested and then he's subsequently crucified. Now, in the days of Jesus' time, the Passover was held annually to commemorate an important Jewish festival. We don't have time to go into that, but you look at the Exodus and you would see the background to that. In Mark 14 verse 12, the disciples ask Jesus where they are to prepare the Passover meal at that particular evening. And in other words, this is on the day of the preparation for the Passover. What you do is you sacrifice lambs. You sacrifice lambs on the day of the preparation for the Passover, and the day starts in the night, just as in the Islamic calendar. So it starts in the night, and Jesus has a supper, and he says, after he breaks the unleavened bread, he says, this is my body. Then he takes a cup, and he says, after drinking wine, this is the blood of the covenant. And then he's arrested after the Passover meal. He goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he is killed. The day he's killed, he dies on the day of the Passover, the morning after the Passover meal was eaten, in Mark's Gospel. In John's Gospel, for example, you find something similar here too. Jesus goes to Jerusalem in the last of his week to celebrate the Passover feast, etc., etc. But strikingly in John, at the beginning of the account, in contrast to Mark, the disciples do not ask Jesus where they are to prepare the Passover. In fact, he gives them no instructions to prepare a meal. He gives them no instructions, nothing about the bread being his body or the blood being the wine representing his blood, nothing at all. Instead, he washes his disciples' feet. And interestingly enough, he's kidnapped, killed. The next day, Pilate pronounces the sentence, and in John 19:14 you read, "It was on the day of the preparation for the Passover, and it was about noon." Noon? On the day of the preparation for the Passover? The day that the lambs were meant to be slaughtered, Jesus was killed? In Mark's Gospel, Jesus lived through that day. And he was basically killed at 9 o'clock in the morning, in Mark 15:25, after he had eaten the Passover meal. In John's Gospel, he's actually killed on the day of the preparation for Passover, when the lambs were sacrificed. Why? Why is that the case? The case is because John is the only Gospel that indicates that Jesus is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And that's declared by John the Baptist himself at the very beginning of the narrative in John chapter 1. So why then did John, our latest Gospel, change the day and the time when Jesus died? It may be, as many scholars have said, that because in John's Gospel, for the very first time, Jesus is that Passover lamb. And so Jesus has to die on that day, the day of the preparation, and the time, sometime afternoon, when the Passover lambs were killed. So in other words, John, or whoever wrote John, has changed the historical datum in order to make a particular theological point. Jesus is that sacrificial lamb. And in order to make a theological point, John now has to create a discrepancy between his account and the account of the others. That's why in Mark's Gospel, Jesus has a Passover meal and then he dies the next day. In John's Gospel, Jesus dies on the day of the preparation for the Passover. But you can see the reason. Can you see that evolution, that evolutionary process that takes place? And you could go on and on. How much time do I have left? Is it 0? Are you sure? I've just got so much more to give. And you could go on. You could go on with other accounts. I mean, you look at, for example, the story of the birth of Jesus. Look at the birth of Jesus. There are two accounts in the birth of Jesus. One is in the account in Matthew, and the other is the account in Luke. And it's interesting that in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus' birth occurred during Herod's reign. In Luke's Gospel, Jesus' birth occurred during the reign when Quirinius was actually the governor of Syria. Now, bear this in mind, that we know from a number of historical writings, including the Roman author Tacitus and the Jewish historian Josephus, that Quirinius did not become governor of Syria until the year 6. Which is 10 years after the death of Herod. So if Jesus was born in Matthew's Gospel according to the reign of Herod, then how is it possible that he could have been born in Luke's Gospel in the year 6 during the reign of Quirinius, who had basically become the governor of Syria 10 years after the death of Herod, or 10 years after the time of Herod? So the point, folks, is this. On the level of what we've got before us, and what I've basically put forth in this limited time period is essentially just a drop in the ocean. There's just so much more to give, and we've got limited time. That's why I suggested initially an hour each, but I tend to get a bit long-winded. In conclusion, I'd basically like to say that on one level, there are significant discrepancies in the existing New Testament, and it simply sets out to confirm the Quranic position, which says that Jesus was a recipient of revelation, that Moses was a recipient of revelation, all these prophets were recipients of revelations, but that revelation was never preserved in its actual pristine purity. There are errors in existence if the Bible is looked historically. Does this mean that it is impossible and no longer acceptable for a person to be a Christian? I would submit that only Christians of a certain persuasion, such as those, for example, who live in the American South, the Southern Baptists, who would basically hell-bent believe in the inerrancy of the Old and the New Testament. But the answer again is that a Christianity which is dependent on the inerrancy of the Bible probably cannot survive the reality of the actual discrepancies that basically arrive. And of course, there are lots of forms of the Christian faith which can exist, many of them unscathed. But the fact is that the New Testament, and indeed the Bible as a whole, is not a completely perfect book. I'm quite interested to see the response. I know it'll be unfair for David to come and do a response in 10 minutes. You need probably a longer time period. And of course, I needed a longer time period to amplify quite a bit of what I had to say. But I think time is obviously always at a premium. So I'd leave you with these words. So I'll be interested in hearing David's response. And we can continue this discussion in a mutually amicable manner. I'd just like to end with a verse from the Qur'an which says, وَقُلْ جَاءَ الْحَقُّ وَزَهَقَ الْبَاطِلِ إِنَّ الْبَاطِلَ كَانَ زَهُوقًا. That when truth comes across that which is untrue, then truth shall finally perish. For truth, for anything that is not true and incorrect, it's by its nature bound to perish. Thank you very much. Wa akhiru dawana and alhamdulillah rabbil alameen.
Okay, we're now going to have a 10-minute rebuttal, and we're going to try and stay with the time limit, and then after that, Yusuf will have 10 minutes to answer, and then we will have a 5-minute closing statement from each of them. Okay, inshallah.